Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the evening wasn't about scrolling through screens or binge watching shows. A time when sunset didn't mean the day was over, but rather that a different kind of day was just beginning. We're talking about medieval evenings, those long quiet hours between the end of work and the beginning of sleep. Now, you might be thinking that medieval people just went to bed when it got dark. After all, without electricity, what else was there to do? But the reality was far more complex, far more textured than we usually imagine. The evening hours were filled with activities, conversations, small rituals, and quiet moments that shaped the rhythm of medieval life in ways we've mostly forgotten. So settle in, get comfortable, because we're going to explore these evening hours in detail. Not the exciting parts of medieval life, not the battles or the feasts or the grand ceremonies, just the evenings, the ordinary, everyday transition from daylight to darkness, from work to rest, from the public world to the private one. And fair warning, this is going to be slow. This is going to be detailed, because that's how medieval evenings were. Slow, detailed, filled with small moments that seemed insignificant, but weren't. Not really. Let's begin. The evening really began with a sound. A specific sound that marked the transition from one part of the day to another. For most medieval people, that sound was a bell. In villages and towns across medieval Europe, church bells marked the hours. Not clock hours as we know them, but canonical hours. The times when monks and clergy would gather for prayer. And the most important of these evening bells was vespers. The bell for vespers usually rang around what we would call 6 p.m., though the exact time varied with the seasons. When you heard that bell, you knew. The workday was coming to an end. Not immediately, perhaps. There were still things to finish, tools to put away, animals to secure for the night. But the bell created a shift in the air, a change in the tempo of life. For a peasant working in the fields, the vespers bell meant you had maybe another hour of good light, maybe less, depending on the season. In summer, you might push until the light was truly fading. In winter, you'd been watching the sun sink lower for the past hour, knowing the cold would drive you inside soon, regardless of what the bell said. The thing about medieval work was that it was tied to daylight in a way that's hard for us to understand now. We flip a switch and keep going. They couldn't. When the light faded, most outdoor work became impossible, dangerous even. So the evening wasn't just about choosing to stop work. It was about having to stop, about surrendering to the inevitable darkness. Let's say you're a peasant farmer, a man or woman working a small plot of land outside a village. The vespers bell has rung. You've got your hoe or your scythe or whatever tool you've been using. What happens next? Well, you don't just drop it in the field. Tools were valuable, expensive. For most peasants, a good iron hoe represented a significant investment. You couldn't just buy a new one if yours broke or rusted away. So you took care of it. This meant taking a few minutes at the end of each workday to clean your tools. If you'd been working in muddy soil, you'd scrape the mud off with a stick or a stone. You'd wipe the metal parts with a cloth, or with grass if you didn't have a cloth. You'd check for damage, a crack in the wooden handle, a chip in the blade. Then you'd carry your tools back to wherever you kept them. For most peasants, this was either inside your cottage or in a small outbuilding. Some people hung their tools on the wall. Others leaned them in a corner. The important thing was that they were under cover, protected from rain and dew. This sounds simple, doesn't it? Obvious even. But it took time. And more importantly, it took attention. You couldn't rush through it. You had to do it properly, or you'd pay for it later when your tools failed at a critical moment. If you had animals, and most peasants had at least a few, there was a whole routine involved in settling them for the night. Chickens needed to be herded into their coop. This was usually easier said than done. Chickens, despite their reputation for being stupid, are actually quite good at not doing what you want them to do. So you'd spend 10 or 15 minutes encouraging, cajoling, sometimes chasing your chickens back to where they were supposed to be. Why bother? Because foxes, weasels, martens, any number of predators that became active at dusk and would happily kill every chicken you owned if you left them out. So into the coop they went, and you'd secure the door with whatever latch or rope or weight you used. If you had a cow, and many peasants did, you would need to bring it in from wherever it had been grazing. Lead it back to its shed or stall. Make sure it had clean straw to lie on. Maybe give it a bit of hay if you had any to spare. Though, hay was often too precious to use except in winter. Pigs, if you kept them, might already be in their pen. Or they might be rooting around nearby. Pigs were usually left to forage during the day, eating whatever they could find. But at night, you wanted them contained. Partly for their own safety, partly so they didn't wander off or damage someone else's property. All of this took time, a lot of time. By the time you'd dealt with all your animals, checked on them, made sure they were settled, the light would be noticeably dimmer than when you'd heard the vespers bell. For some people, the end of the workday meant a journey. Not a long one, necessarily, but a walk from the fields back to the village, or from a workshop back to a home. Medieval villages were often surprisingly spread out. The church and the main cluster of houses might be in one place, but the fields extended outward in strips. If your strips were on the far edge of the village's land, you might have a walk of a mile or more to get home. This walk was, well, it was just a walk, but it was a consistent part of the daily rhythm. And like everything else in medieval life, it was affected by the season and the weather. In summer, the walk home might be pleasant, the air still warm, the light soft and golden. You might walk with neighbours, talking about the day's work, about crops, about whatever small dramas were unfolding in the village life. In winter, though, the walk home was something else entirely. The air cold and damp, the light failing rapidly, the path muddy or icy or hidden under snow. You'd walk quickly, head down, focused on getting back to warmth and shelter. And always, there was awareness of the changing light. In a world without streetlights, without flashlights, without any reliable source of portable illumination, darkness wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a genuine hazard. You could trip, fall into a ditch, lose your way. So you paid attention to the fading light. You moved with purpose. You got home. Finally, you'd arrive at your cottage. Your home, the place you'd left in the early morning when the world was still dark and cold. The first thing you'd notice was the smell. Smoke from the fire, if someone had kept it going during the day. The earthy smell of the dirt floor. The smell of whatever food had been cooked recently, lingering in the air. The cottage would be dim inside. Even if there were small windows, they didn't let in much light. And as the evening progressed, those windows would darken completely, becoming just slightly lighter squares in the walls. If you lived alone, the cottage would be empty, quiet, waiting for you to bring it back to life. If you had a family, there would already be activity. Children playing or doing small chores, a wife or husband preparing the evening meal. The sound of voices, movement, life. You'd take off whatever outer garment you'd been wearing. Hang it up or drape it over something to dry if it was damp. Maybe sit down for a moment, just to rest. To transition from the world of work to the world of home. This transition was important. It was a moment of pause, a breath between one part of the day and the next. And while it might only last a few minutes, it mattered. It marked the shift from being a worker to being a person at home. The evening meal in a medieval peasant household wasn't like our dinners. It wasn't a single course served at a set time with everyone sitting around a table. It was simpler than that, and more complicated. Let's start with the fire, because everything began with the fire. Most peasant cottages had a central hearth, just a spot in the middle of the floor where you could build a fire, with a hole in the roof above to let the smoke out. Or sometimes the fire was built against a wall, with a chimney of sorts. Either way, the fire was the heart of the home. Literally, if the fire had been burning all day, you'd need to add more wood. Not just any wood, but wood you'd gathered and dried. In many parts of medieval Europe, wood was becoming scarce. Forests were being cleared for farmland. What wood remained was often controlled by the nobility, who didn't take kindly to peasants cutting down trees without permission. So the wood you burned was precious. Dead branches, fallen wood, scraps from whatever sources you could find. You used it carefully, fed the fire slowly, kept it going at the lowest level that would still be useful. Once the fire was at the right level, you'd prepare the evening meal. And here's where we need to talk about what medieval peasants actually ate. The short answer is pottage. Almost always pottage. Pottage was, well, imagine a thick soup or a thin stew. It was made in a pot, suspended over or next to the fire. And it could contain almost anything, depending on the season and what you had available. The base of pottage was usually grain. Barley, oats, sometimes wheat if you were lucky. You'd add water, bring it to a boil, then let it simmer. As it cooked, you'd add other things. In late summer or early autumn, you might have vegetables. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans. You'd chop them up, toss them in. Maybe some herbs. Parsley, thyme, sage if you grew them in a small garden. In spring, before the new harvest but after the old stores were running low, your pottage might be thinner. More water, less grain. Maybe some wild greens you'd gathered. A bit of old salted meat if you had any. It wouldn't be a feast. It would be fuel, sustenance. In winter, if you'd managed your resources well, you might have dried peas or beans to add. Maybe a small piece of salted pork or bacon, saved from the autumn pig slaughter. The pork wouldn't be much, just enough to give the pottage some flavour. A hint of fat and salt. The pottage would cook slowly. You'd stir it occasionally with a wooden spoon. Add more water if it got too thick. Taste it. Add a pinch of salt if you had salt to spare. And gradually, over the course of maybe an hour, it would transform from ingredients into a meal. Alongside the pottage, there was bread. Bread was fundamental to the medieval diet. It was eaten at every meal, Not the soft, fluffy bread we're used to, but dense, dark bread made from whatever grain you had. For most peasants, bread was made from rye or barley. Wheat bread was for the wealthy. The bread would be baked, but not necessarily by you. Many villages had a communal oven, and you would bring your dough there to be baked, paying a small fee for the privilege. The bread would be dark brown, dense, sometimes gritty from the stone ground flour. It would keep for days, even weeks, becoming harder and drier as time passed. You would tear off pieces and dip them in your pottage to soften them. And then there was beer. Or ale, technically, since medieval beer didn't have hops. Medieval people drank ale with every meal. Not because they were constantly drunk, but because water was often unsafe. The brewing process made ale safe to drink, and the ale that common people drank wasn't particularly strong. It was weak, watery stuff. Small beer, or small ale it was called. The ale would be stored in a barrel or large jug. You'd pour it into wooden cups or simple pottery vessels. It would be cloudy, slightly sour, flat, since there was no carbonation. But it was liquid, and it was safe, and it accompanied the meal. Now, the actual eating of the evening meal. This was simpler than you might expect. There was no dining table in most peasant cottages. There wasn't room for one. Instead, people sat wherever they could. On stools, if they had them. On benches. On the edge of the bed. On the floor. The pottage would be in a large communal bowl, probably wooden, possibly ceramic if the family was relatively well off. Everyone would eat from this same bowl using wooden spoons. Or, if spoons were scarce, pieces of bread to scoop up the pottage. There was no concept of everyone having their own plate. No separate servings. You reached in, got your portion, ate it. Reached in again. The meal was communal by necessity. Children would eat first, or at least the youngest children would. Then adults. Or sometimes everyone ate together, gathered around the fire, the bowl in the middle. The conversation during the meal would be minimal. People were hungry. They ate. They focused on the food. There might be a few words about the day's work, about tomorrow's plans, but mostly there was just the sound of eating, spoons against wood, swallowing. The quiet consumption of food. This wasn't a leisurely meal. It wasn't entertainment or social time. It was eating, refueling, putting food into bodies that had worked hard all day and would work hard again tomorrow. The meal would last maybe 20 minutes, 30 at most. You'd eat until the pottage was gone or until you were full. You'd have a piece of bread, a cup of ale, and then the meal was over. After the meal came cleanup. This was quick because there wasn't much to clean. The communal bowl would be wiped out with bread or a cloth. The spoons would be wiped clean. Everything would be set aside for the next meal. The pot that had held the pottage would be left by the fire. You might rinse it with a bit of water, or you might leave it until morning, when you'd make more pottage, and any residue from tonight's meal would just become part of tomorrow's. This might sound unhygienic to us, but in a world where every drop of water had to be carried from a well or stream, where hot water was a luxury, where soap was expensive and rare, you cleaned things only as much as necessary. You didn't waste effort or resources on excessive cleanliness. The cleanup would take 5 minutes, maybe 10, and then that part of the evening was done. Now we come to a crucial challenge of medieval evenings: light, or rather the lack of it. Once the sun went down completely, the inside of a peasant cottage was dark, very dark. The fire provided some light, but firelight is dim and flickering. It illuminates a small area immediately around it, but the corners of the room disappear into shadow. There were, of course, other sources of light. Candles and oil lamps existed, but for peasants these were expensive luxuries, not everyday items. Candles were made from tallow, animal fat, or from beeswax. Beeswax candles were far superior, burning cleaner and brighter, but they were expensive, reserved for churches and wealthy homes. Tallow candles were what common people used, if they used candles at all. But even tallow candles weren't cheap. You had to save up animal fat, which was a valuable cooking ingredient. You had to know how to make candles, which required time and skill. A peasant household might have a few candles, saved for special occasions or emergencies. But burning a candle just to see better on an ordinary evening? That was wasteful. Oil lamps were similar. They required oil, fish oil, or occasionally vegetable oil, which again was a valuable resource better used for cooking. So most peasants spent their evenings in near darkness. The fire provided a bit of light. If there was a moon, moonlight might seep through the windows. But mostly, you learned to do things by feel, by memory, by the dim glow of embers. This had profound effects on what you could do in the evening. Reading? Impossible for most people anyway, since most peasants were illiterate. But even if you could read, you couldn't do it without light. Fine handwork, sewing. Only if you sat very close to the fire, straining your eyes in the flickering light. So the evening activities of medieval peasants were activities that could be done in the dark, or activities that required only occasional glances at what you were doing. One of the main evening activities was simply maintaining the fire. This was continuous, low-level work that someone, usually a woman or older child, would do throughout the evening. You couldn't let the fire go out. Fire was too precious, too difficult to restart. In a world before matches, before even reliable flint and steel for many people, keeping a fire going was crucial. If your fire went out, you'd have to borrow embers from a neighbor. This was humiliating. It announced to everyone that you'd failed in one of the basic tasks of household management. So you kept your fire going. This meant feeding it regularly with small amounts of fuel, adjusting the wood so it burned efficiently, moving the pot if you were keeping something warm, poking the fire to keep it from dying down too much. When you went to bed, you'd bank the fire. This meant covering it partially with ashes, which would slow the burning and keep the coals alive through the night. In the morning, you'd uncover the coals, add tinder and small sticks, and coax the fire back to life. So throughout the evening, someone would be tending the fire. Not constantly, not actively, but aware of it, keeping an eye on it, making small adjustments. It was background work, but it was important. Despite the poor light, people did do handwork in the evening, particularly the kind of handwork that was necessary for maintaining their limited possessions. Clothes, for instance, needed constant repair. Medieval clothing, especially peasant clothing, was worn hard and worn often. Things ripped, seams came apart, hems came undone. So women, and sometimes men, though mending was considered women's work in most places, would sit by the fire with needle and thread, repairing damage. This wasn't fine embroidery. This was practical mending. You'd feel the rip with your fingers, guide the needle through by touch more than sight. The stitches didn't need to be pretty. They needed to hold. Sometimes people would spin thread in the evening. This is where we get the term spinster, a woman who spun thread. Spinning could be done largely by feel. Once you knew how, you'd sit with a distaff, a stick that held the unspun fibre, and a spindle. And you'd draft out the fibre and twist it into thread. The motion was repetitive, almost meditative. You could do it while thinking about other things, while talking, while listening to someone tell a story. Your hands knew what to do. The light didn't matter as much. Men might do other types of work, carving wooden spoons or bowls, repairing tools, weaving baskets. Again, these were things that could be done by firelight, where precision wasn't absolutely critical. The work was slow, it filled time, and it was necessary. These weren't hobbies. These were maintenance tasks that had to be done to keep the household functioning. But probably the most common evening activity was simply talking. In a world without books for most people, without entertainment beyond what you created yourself, conversation was everything. It was news, it was entertainment, it was education for children, it was social bonding. Families would sit together and talk about the day, about the weather, about what needed to be done tomorrow. This sounds mundane, and it was, but it was also the texture of life. The wheat in the north field is looking ready. Maybe another week. Did you see the smith's new apprentice? Seems a clumsy boy. We'll need to gather more wood before the cold sets in. The Baron's men came through today, looking for poachers again. Small observations, small concerns, small pieces of information passed between people who knew each other intimately, who shared every aspect of their lives. Sometimes there will be stories, tales passed down through generations, stories of saints and miracles, which even illiterate peasants knew from church. Folk tales about clever peasants and stupid nobles, about magical creatures and ancient heroes. These stories weren't written down. They lived in memory, changing slightly with each telling. A parent would tell children a story they'd heard from their own parents. The children would remember it, mostly, and one day tell it to their own children. The stories filled the evening darkness. They made the time pass. They entertained, but they also taught lessons, reinforced community values, gave people a sense of connection to the past. While adults were working or talking, children had their own evening activities. Young children would play, of course. Simple games with simple toys. A ball made of rags. Dolls made from scraps of cloth or carved from wood. They'd play quietly, or as quietly as children ever play, near the fire where it was warm and where adults could keep an eye on them. Older children would help with work. A girl of 7 or 8 would be learning to spin or helping with mending. A boy might be learning to carve or helping his father with some task. This was education, not school, but the practical learning of the skills they'd need as adults. Sometimes children would be sent to bed early, especially in winter when fuel for the fire was precious. No point in keeping them up if there wasn't work for them to do, and if putting them to bed meant less space to heat. Children in medieval times were expected to be useful from a young age. Childhood, as we understand it, a time of prolonged play and learning, didn't really exist. By age 7 or so, a child was expected to contribute to the household, to work, to be helpful, not a burden. So children's evening activities were a mix of play and work, with the balance shifting toward work as they got older. For many medieval people, The evening included some form of religious observance. Prayer, specifically. Peasants couldn't read the Latin prayers that priests used, but they knew the Lord's Prayer in their own language. They knew simple devotions, and they were expected to say prayers at certain times of the day. Compline, the last prayer service of the day, was supposed to be observed before bed. For monks in monasteries, this meant gathering in the chapel and chanting specific psalms and prayers. For peasants, it meant, well, something simpler. A family might gather and kneel briefly. The father might lead a simple prayer. Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, the Our Father, which even illiterate peasants knew. Maybe a prayer to Mary. Maybe a prayer for protection through the night. These prayers were quick, a few minutes at most. But they were expected. They were part of the rhythm of the day. They marked the transition from evening to night, from activity to rest. Religion was woven through medieval life in a way that's hard for us to understand now. It wasn't something you did on Sundays. It was part of every day. The bells that marked the hours were church bells, calling monks to prayer. The calendar was organized around saints' days and religious festivals. The prayers you said were as much a part of your routine as eating or working. So evening prayers weren't particularly devout or emotional for most people. They were just something you did. Because that's what people did. Because God was watching. Because you'd been taught since childhood that this was necessary. As the evening progressed and people grew tired, there was a routine for preparing the cottage for the night. First, you'd make sure the door was secured. Medieval peasant cottages didn't have locks, at least not complicated ones. But you'd close the door and secure it with a wooden bar or a rope tied to something sturdy. This wasn't really to prevent burglars. Most peasants didn't own anything worth stealing. It was to keep out animals, dogs, pigs that might have gotten loose. In winter, it was to keep out the cold. Windows, if you had them, would be shuttered. Again, medieval glass was expensive. Peasant windows were usually just holes in the wall, sometimes covered with oiled cloth or thin scraped horn to let in light while keeping out weather. At night, you'd close wooden shutters over these openings. This made the cottage darker still and quieter. The outside world was shut away. You were enclosed in your small space, with only your family and the dying fire. You would check on the animals one last time if they were housed near the cottage or in an attached shed. Make sure they were settled. Make sure nothing had gone wrong. All of this took maybe 15 minutes. It was routine. You didn't think about it much, but it was important. It marked the final transition from evening to night, from activity to rest. We mentioned this earlier, but it's worth going into more detail about banking the fire for the night. By now, you'd have stopped feeding the fire. It would be burning down, the flames getting smaller, the wood turning to coals. What you wanted was for those coals to last through the night without burning out completely. So you'd use a stick or a small shovel to push ash over the coals, not completely covering them, but insulating them. This would slow the burning dramatically. The coals would continue to glow under the ash, very slowly consuming what fuel remained. In the morning, you'd sweep the ash away, revealing the still glowing coals. You'd add tinder, dry grass, wood shavings, anything that caught fire easily, and blow gently on the coals. The tinder would catch, and you'd add small sticks, then larger pieces of wood, building the fire back up. This was enormously important. If you did it wrong, if you smothered the coals too much, they'd go out during the night. And then you'd face the morning with the humiliation and difficulty of restarting your fire from scratch. So banking the fire was done carefully, with attention. You'd check it once, maybe twice, before finally going to bed, making sure it was right, making sure it would last. Now, personal preparation for sleep. This was, well, minimal. Medieval peasants didn't have pajamas. They didn't have nightgowns, not in the sense we'd recognize. What they had was the undergarments they'd been wearing all day. A linen shirt or shift. That's what you slept in. Your outer clothes. Your tunic or gown. Your hose or stockings. You'd take these off. They were your good clothes, or at least your less dirty clothes. You didn't want to wear them out by sleeping in them, so you'd undress down to your undergarment. This wasn't a private process necessarily. In a one-room cottage with a whole family, privacy didn't exist. Everyone was just there. You turned away, perhaps. You were quick about it. But there was no bathroom to change in, no separate bedroom to provide privacy. Washing before bed? Maybe. If you had water handy and it wasn't too cold, you might splash a bit of water on your face and hands. But a full wash was unlikely. Water was work. You didn't waste it. You might need to use the toilet. Peasant cottages didn't have indoor plumbing, obviously. What they usually had was a bucket or pot that served as a chamber pot. You'd use it if needed, and it would be emptied in the morning. Or you might step outside to a designated spot, an outdoor privy if the family had one. This meant opening the door you'd just secured, going out into the cold dark, doing your business, and coming back in. Not pleasant, especially in winter, but necessary. Now we come to the bed. Beds in medieval peasant cottages were, well, they varied. Some families had an actual bed frame, a simple wooden structure with ropes strung across to support a mattress. This was a significant piece of furniture, one of the most valuable items in the household. The mattress would be a cloth bag stuffed with straw, or possibly with wool if the family could afford it. Straw mattresses needed to be refilled regularly as the straw broke down and became less comfortable. They were also home to fleas and bedbugs, but that was just accepted as part of life. Other families didn't have a proper bed frame. They slept on straw pallets laid directly on the floor. A cloth sack filled with straw, flattened down by the weight of bodies over time, uncomfortable and cold, but better than sleeping on bare ground. For covering, there would be blankets. Wool blankets were best, but expensive. Some families had only rough cloth or old clothing to cover themselves with. In winter, you'd pile on whatever you had, trying to stay warm. Here's where it gets interesting, or perhaps unsettling to modern sensibilities. Most families shared beds, not just husband and wife, but children too. A family of 5 or 6 might all sleep in the same bed, huddled together for warmth. This wasn't considered strange or inappropriate. It was practical. Body heat was warmth, and warmth was survival, especially in winter. Privacy, personal space. These were luxuries that peasants couldn't afford. Older children or adults might sleep separately if there was space. Perhaps on a bench along the wall, perhaps on straw on the floor. But the main bed was usually communal. This meant that going to bed was a social activity. You couldn't just drift off when you felt like it. You had to coordinate with others, wait for everyone to be ready. Arrange yourselves in the bed so everyone fit. Finally, everyone would be in bed. The fire would be banked, just a faint glow in the darkness. The cottage would be as secure as it could be. Outside, the night would be deep and quiet, or perhaps full of the sounds of wind or rain or animals moving in the dark. And then you'd try to sleep. But sleep didn't come immediately. Not always. There was a period of transition, a time when you were lying in bed, but still aware of the world around you. You'd feel the discomfort of the straw mattress, the way it poked through the cloth in places. You'd adjust your position, trying to find a comfortable spot. You'd pull the blanket up or push it down if you were too warm. If you shared the bed, you'd be aware of the others. A child might move restlessly. A spouse might snore. Someone might get up to use the chamber pot, disturbing everyone else. You'd think about the next day, about the work that needed doing, about concerns, worries, plans. In a life that was largely about survival, there was always something to worry about. Would the crops be good? Would the harvest be sufficient? Would winter be harsh? You might pray again, silently. A simple plea for protection, for provision. God, keep us through the night. God, grant us tomorrow. And gradually, slowly, with the sounds of breathing around you and the faint glow of the banked fire, you drift towards sleep. Medieval sleep was different from modern sleep in ways we don't often think about. For one thing, it was often interrupted. The idea of sleeping straight through the night, 8 hours uninterrupted, was not the norm. Instead, many people followed what historians call segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep. You'd go to bed relatively early, perhaps an hour or two after sunset. You'd sleep for several hours, 4 or 5 perhaps. Then you'd wake up, not because of an alarm or because you'd slept enough, but naturally. This was called the first sleep. After waking from your first sleep, you'd be awake for an hour or two. Not fully awake, not ready to start the day, just awake, in the darkness, in the quiet. What did people do during this time? Well, they stayed in bed, mostly. It was too dark and too cold to do much else. But they weren't idle. Sometimes people would pray. The quiet darkness was considered a good time for contemplation, for speaking with God. Some religious writers even recommended this practice, suggesting that the middle of the night was when the mind was clearest. Sometimes people would talk. Husband and wife might have a quiet conversation about their lives, their plans, their feelings. In the darkness, with no distractions. These conversations could be intimate and meaningful. Sometimes people would, be intimate in other ways. Historians have found references to couples using this middle-of-the-night period for sex. In a one-room cottage with children present, privacy was rare. The darkness and the assumption that children were asleep made this the most private time available. Sometimes people would just lie there, thinking, letting their minds wander, remembering dreams from the first sleep, anticipating the dreams of the second sleep. And then, after an hour or two of this wakefulness, you'd slip back into sleep, the second sleep. This would last until dawn or shortly before, when the need to start the day's work would pull you from bed. This pattern of a segmented sleep was common throughout the medieval period and into the early modern era. It only changed with the coming of artificial lighting, which allowed people to stay up later and made sleeping through the night in one long period more practical. Even when you were asleep, you were never entirely disconnected from the world. The night was full of sounds, and some of them would penetrate your sleep, pulling you toward wakefulness or integrating into your dreams. Inside the cottage, you might hear the fire shifting, a log settling, sending up a small shower of sparks. The sound would be soft, but in the deep quiet of night, it was noticeable. You'd hear the breathing of others in the bed with you, sometimes snoring, sometimes the restless movements of children having dreams, sometimes the sound of someone getting up to use the chamber pot, their footsteps creaking on the floor. Outside, there were other sounds. Wind, if it was blowing. The creaking of the cottage itself as the wood settled and adjusted to temperature changes. Rain on the thatch roof. A sound like thousands of tiny fingers drumming. Animals made noise too. Dogs barking somewhere in the village. Foxes calling to each other with their eerie, almost human-sounding cries. Owls hunting. Rats or mice moving around in the thatch or in the corners of the cottage. In spring and summer, there would be frogs. Thousands of them sometimes making a chorus that was almost deafening if you lived near water. Crickets chirping, night birds calling. Some of these sounds were comforting. They were familiar, part of the normal soundscape of night. You'd grown up hearing them. They told you that the world was as it should be. Other sounds were alarming, unusual sounds. A sound that might be someone or something approaching the cottage. A sound that might indicate danger. People were alert to these sounds even in sleep. You'd wake at an unusual noise, your heart beating fast, wondering what it was. Often it would turn out to be nothing. An animal. The wind. Something innocent. But in the moment, in the darkness, every unexpected sound could be frightening. Medieval people dreamed, of course, just as we do. But they thought about dreams differently. Dreams were believed to be significant. They might be messages from God. They might be visitations from the dead. They might be omens of the future. People paid attention to their dreams, tried to remember them, discussed them with others. There were even dream interpretation guides, though these were usually in Latin and accessible only to educated clergy. But the basic ideas filtered down to common people. Certain symbols in dreams meant certain things. A dream of water might mean coming prosperity. A dream of fire might warn of danger. Nightmares were particularly concerning. A nightmare might be the work of demons, creatures that came in the night to torment sleepers. Or it might be caused by indigestion. Medieval people understood that eating certain foods before bed could lead to disturbing dreams. Some people took protective measures against nightmares. They'd hang herbs by the bed. Valerian mugwort, plants that were supposed to ward off evil influences. They'd say particular prayers before sleeping. They'd make the sign of the cross. But despite these efforts, nightmares happened. You'd wake suddenly, heart pounding, the dream still vivid and terrible. And in the darkness of a medieval night, with no way to turn on a light and reassure yourself, the lingering fear of the nightmare was hard to shake off. You'd lie there, breathing hard, trying to calm down, trying to remember that it was just a dream, trying to push the images away so you could sleep again. Sometimes a nightmare would wake others in the bed. You'd cry out or thrash around, and suddenly everyone was awake. There would be murmured questions. What's wrong? What did you dream? And you'd try to explain, to share the burden of the fear, to make it less powerful by speaking it aloud. Medieval people had specific fears associated with night. These weren't just the universal fear of darkness that many people share. These were culturally specific fears, rooted in medieval beliefs about the world. There was fear of thieves, of course. Though, as we've mentioned, most peasants didn't have much worth stealing. But the fear was there anyway. Someone might break in, harm you, take what little you had. There was fear of fire. With an open fire in the middle of a wooden cottage with a thatch roof, the danger was real. A spark landing on dry straw, the thatch catching, the whole cottage going up in flames. It happened. Everyone knew someone who'd lost their home this way. There was fear of supernatural creatures, monsters, demons, the undead. Medieval people believed that night was when these creatures were active. The darkness was their realm. Some creatures had specific associations with night. The mare, from which we get the word nightmare, was a demon that sat on your chest while you slept, causing bad dreams and difficulty breathing. Vampires, or creatures like them, were believed to come out at night to feed on the living. Even natural creatures took on a sinister cast in the dark. Wolves, in areas where they were still common, were a real danger. A pack of wolves could kill livestock, could even threaten humans. The howling of wolves in the night was a sound that could turn your blood cold. And there was simply the fear of the unknown. In the darkness, you couldn't see what was out there. Any sound might be something dangerous. Your imagination would fill in the blanks, creating threats from nothing. Most of the time, nothing bad happened. You'd wake in the morning, and the night would be over, and you'd been safe all along. But the fear was still there, every night. A low-level anxiety that was just part of living in a world before electric lights, before reliable locks, before the rationalism that dismissed monsters and demons. At some point in the very deepest part of the night, there would be a turning, a shift that you might notice if you were awake, or that you might sleep through entirely. The night would reach its darkest point, usually a few hours after midnight. The coldest point too in most seasons. This was when the world seemed most still, most quiet, most empty. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, things would begin to change. The darkness would start, very gradually, to lighten. Not enough to see by. Not anything like daylight. But if you were awake and paying attention, you might notice that the window shutters were no longer quite as completely black as they had been. Birds would start to make sounds. Roosters, of course. Roosters were famous for their dawn crowing. But other birds too, beginning their morning songs while it was still dark. The air would change. In spring and summer, you might feel a slight breeze pick up. In winter, the cold might deepen even further before the sun's eventual rising would bring a tiny bit of warmth. These changes marked the approaching end of night, the world getting ready to transition back to day, back to light, back to activity. If you were awake during this time, experiencing segmented sleep's wakeful period, you might feel a sense of anticipation. Morning was coming. Soon you'd need to get up to start work, to face another day. The rest was nearly over. Or you might feel a sense of peace. You'd made it through another night. You were safe. Your family was safe. The day would bring its own challenges. But for now, in these quiet moments before dawn, there was a kind of stillness that could feel almost sacred. Eventually, whether after segmented sleep or after sleeping through, you'd wake for the final time. The one that meant getting up. For most peasants, this happened before dawn. You couldn't afford to waste daylight. The day's work needed to start early, especially in summer when there was so much to do. What woke you? Sometimes it was natural. Your body's internal clock, trained by years of rising at the same time. Sometimes it was a sound, a rooster crowing, a neighbor starting their day, the sound of a cart on the road outside. Sometimes it was discomfort. The straw mattress had gotten increasingly uncomfortable. Through the night, your body ached from lying on it. You needed to move. Sometimes it was simply cold. The fire had died down to nothing overnight. Despite your banking, the cottage was freezing. Staying in bed under the blankets was pleasant, but you knew you needed to get up and restart the fire, or you'd never warm up. So you'd wake, fully, finally, and you'd lie there for a moment, making the transition from sleep to wakefulness, remembering who you were, where you were, what day it was. Actually getting out of bed was a process. First, you had to disentangle yourself from the other people in the bed without waking them, if possible. Carefully moving arms and legs, slowly sitting up, trying not to disturb the blankets too much. The air in the cottage would be cold, much colder than under the blankets. You'd shiver immediately. Your breath would be visible in the dim light. You'd fumble for your outer clothes in the darkness. Put them on quickly. They'd be cold too, stiff with the night's chill. But they were necessary. Your body would protest. Everything was stiff. Your muscles ached from the day before's work and from sleeping on an uncomfortable surface. You'd stretch, carefully, quietly, work out the worst of the stiffness. If your bladder was full, you would use the chamber pot. Or you'd step outside into the pre-dawn darkness to relieve yourself. Outside, the air would be even colder. The world would be dark and quiet, but with that sense of approaching dawn that you could feel even if you couldn't yet see. The first order of business was always the fire. Without fire, there was no heat, no light, no ability to cook. Everything else depended on getting the fire going. You'd approach the hearth, kneel down, feel for the stick you used to poke the fire. In the near total darkness, you'd feel more than see what you were doing. First, you'd carefully push aside the ashes you'd banked over the coals the night before, hoping, always hoping, that the coals were still alive, that they'd made it through the night. If you were lucky, you'd see a faint glow. Dim red coals, still warm, still capable of becoming flame. Relief would flood through you. You'd add tinder, dry grass, wood shavings, small twigs. Anything that would catch quickly. You'd arrange it carefully over the coals. Then you'd blow, gently, steadily, encouraging the coals to give their heat to the tinder, watching for that first curl of smoke, that first small flame. It might take several tries. You'd blow until you were light-headed. But eventually, if the coals had survived, the tinder would catch. A small flame would appear, growing quickly as it consumed the dry material. You'd add slightly larger sticks. Feed the fire carefully. Let it grow. And as it grew, light would begin to fill the cottage. Warm, flickering light that pushed back the darkness. With the fire restarted, you could breathe easier. You'd won the first small victory of the day. As the fire grew and the light increased, the cottage would come back to life. Other family members would start to wake. You'd hear stirring from the bed, someone coughing, a child whimpering, the sounds of people beginning another day. You'd put water on to heat. Not much water, just enough for whatever the morning's needs were. As it heated, you'd start thinking about the day ahead. What work needed doing? What was the weather like outside? What problems might you face? This was a transition time. No longer night, not yet really day. A liminal space where you moved from rest to work, from the private world of home to the public world of village and fields. The evening and night were over. The cycle had completed, and now it was starting again. You'd look at the door, still barred from the night. You'd think about opening it, letting in the morning, beginning whatever this day would bring. But for a moment, you'd just sit by the fire, warming your hands, watching the flames, preparing yourself mentally for another day of labor. Because that's what life was. A cycle of work and rest. Day and evening and night. Over and over, each day much like the one before. Each evening following the same rhythms. And that was evening in medieval times. Not exciting, not dramatic, just life. The slow transition from work to rest. The small activities that fill the hours. The gradual surrender to darkness and sleep. It's strange to think about, isn't it? How different their evenings were from ours. How much of their time was spent simply maintaining existence. Making sure the fire didn't go out. Mending clothes, preparing simple food, trying to stay warm. But it's also not that different, fundamentally. We still eat evening meals with our families. We still talk about our days. We still prepare for sleep. The details have changed. The technology has changed. But the basic human rhythms remain. Tonight, when you turn off your lights and go to bed, you might think about those medieval peasants. How they would have marveled at your ability to banish darkness with the flip of a switch. How they would have been amazed by your soft bed, your warm blankets, your ability to control the temperature of your home. But they understood something we've maybe lost. The natural rhythm of light and dark. The way day transitions to evening transitions to night. The importance of fire and warmth and shelter. So as you drift off to sleep, imagine them, centuries ago, in their small cottages, banking their fires, lying down in their shared beds, waiting for sleep to come, just as you are now. Good night.